Good afternoon and welcome to the COVID-19 Military Support Town Hall hosted by the COVID-19 Military Support Initiative, which is being organized by the Association of Defense Communities and Blue Star Families. This is Tim Ford with the Association of Defense Communities. For those who don't know ADC, we have been around for 40 years supporting the resilience of communities, states that support our military. With nearly 300 communities, states, and regions, an affiliated industry organization, ADC represents every major defense community and state in the nation. As this pandemic continues to ravage our nation, everyone is feeling the pain of this crisis. The human toll is growing, and our sympathy and support goes out to all the families who have lost a loved one because of the pandemic. And that now includes our first service member, an Army National Guardsman from New Jersey who passed away this past Saturday. At the same time, our national response to the crisis has begun, and last week Congress passed and the President signed the largest stimulus package in U.S. history. The CARES Act is a $2 trillion bill intended to begin the painful process of supporting our coronavirus-battered economy. Today, we take a deep dive into the stimulus, what it means for DoD and our military families, and what could be coming next in terms of support. Today's event is being hosted by the COVID-19 Military Support Initiative. Through this initiative, ADC and Blue Star families will be providing resources and expertise to support communities, states, and military families through this crisis, including hosting events like today, publishing a daily newsletter that launched last week, and a new website that will be up and running in the coming days. We're also working on a variety of polling projects, research efforts, and policy development work to ensure that communities and families are supported through the crisis. To share more of the results from our initial polling work and some exciting news about the initiative, it's my pleasure to welcome Kathy Roth-Duquette, CEO and co-founder of Blue Star Families. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thanks for all that ADC is doing. Blue Star Families is a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting active duty members, National Guard and Reserve, veterans, and their families from all ranks and services. I want to start out with an exciting announcement this afternoon. We've had some amazing sponsors come on in to help us support this initiative. Our newest sponsor, USAA, has always been a major supporter of the military community and of both Blue Star Families and ADC. They signed on to help us fund this initiative so we can continue to get the information and resources out to the community. We are so grateful. I'd also like to acknowledge our first existing sponsors, the Association of Military Banks of America, the Military Housing Association, and First Command. We're honored to be recognized and supported by these great partners. As part of our military support initiative with ADC, we've been conducting a pain points poll to gauge the greatest challenges our military families are facing in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're continuously analyzing this data as policy changes and developments continue to roll in. A link to the pain point poll will be in your post-webinar email. Please take a minute to take or share that poll with your contacts or your lists. The more we know, the more we're able to share and more we're able to help solve these problems. So a brief update on the poll today. You can see we've had over 1,300 respondents across the country and overseas from all of the military services. 88% of these respondents are military family members, 14% are veteran family members. We've been tracking the most acute pain points. 46% of respondents or their spouses have lost their job, are now unable to work, or have had to reduce their hours as a result of this crisis. So nearly half of our community is facing economic stress. 21% of respondents with PCS orders are currently or in the next 60 days will be paying 2 mortgages or 2 rent payments. 14% can't access special education or support services for their special needs child. 12% are having a problem maintaining continuity of care for mental or behavioral health. You can see that child care is at 11%. People are paying for child care while their provider is closed. And we're seeing food insecurity. 8% unable to afford 1 week of food, 6% currently experiencing food insecurity. Likewise, we have a housing crunch because of delayed PCS, 6% having problems with housing, 5% unable to make their basic rent or utility payments. We'll continue to get more information over the coming weeks. You can see more on the CMSI website. Now, I'd like to turn things back over to Tim from ADC to welcome our first guest.
Thanks, Kathy. This is meant to be a town hall and we want your questions. If you have questions during today's event, please submit them through the chat page, or you can also email info@defensecommunities.org. Our panelists will do the best to field a few questions, time permitting. And if any questions are not answered during the event, we'll do our best to answer them afterwards and post them on our website. It's now my pleasure to welcome our first guest. He's been a great advocate for defense communities in his district, across the state of Washington and the nation. It's my pleasure to welcome Congressman Derek Kilmer. Welcome, Congressman.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me and for allowing me to say a few words for you today. So I represent Washington's 6th Congressional District, which is everything west of Tacoma, the Tacoma and the Olympic Peninsula. We're the home of Naval Base Kitsap. We're right next door to Joint Base Lewis McChord. And across my region, and frankly all around the country, the COVID-19 pandemic is putting extraordinary strain on our healthcare system, on our economy, and on families. I hope you are all, everyone listening, are keeping safe, staying well, and managing through these challenging times. Over the past week, I've had a phone attached to my ear from dawn until dusk, hearing from hospital leaders, local housing authorities, folks at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, disability advocates, veterans organizations, higher ed institutions, immigrant and refugee support groups, labor leaders, small business owners, you name it. And I've done that because I want to hear from folks about how this pandemic and efforts to contain and spread are impacting them, and to learn more about what resources are needed from the federal government. And those conversations really highlighted to me just how much there is that needs to be done and how dire this situation is for so many people. And I believe that what I'm hearing is happening all over the country, to you and to your families, to your neighbors, your coworkers, and to millions of other Americans from all walks of life. The good news is that there is now some more help on the way. On Friday, Congress passed and the President signed a third emergency response bill called the CARES Act, which stands for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. That new law provides bold and urgent action focused really on protecting health and safety and protecting the economic well-being of the American people. And it touches on a number of the concerns that I heard were raised from the last speaker that were raised in your survey. The aim is to provide immediate relief to workers and to families, and to increase medical resources to help those most in need. And let me get into some specifics, and I'll also talk specifically about some of the specific resources targeted to the Defense Department as well. So first off, I don't think that doctors or nurses or other healthcare professionals should have to be on the front lines combating this virus without the personal protective equipment that they need to stay safe. And this bill takes steps to address that. There is included in the bill $150 billion of assistance and resources directed specifically to our hospitals and frontline healthcare providers. I don't think students should have to face disruption, and I don't think college students should have to face additional debt because of circumstances that they couldn't control. And this bill takes steps to address that. With more schools closing due to coronavirus, Congress has provided emergency funding for child nutrition programs to make sure that students can still receive a nutritious meal. We know that there's 22 million kids around our country that get free or reduced price meals. I will mention there was specific efforts in that bill also to direct resources to students with disabilities. Congress also overall secured nearly $31 billion in funding for school districts and for higher education institutions to ensure that people have access to the educational opportunities that they need. Folks shouldn't have to worry about facing foreclosure or eviction through no fault of their own. The last speaker spoke about concerns around rent payments, and this bill takes steps to address that as well. Folks with federally backed mortgages under this new law have the right to request forbearance on their payments for up to 6 months, with a possible extension for another 6 months without fees or penalties or extra interest. And those who are listening can just reach out to their mortgage provider to get the ball rolling on that. Additionally, there are eviction protections for renters who live in public or assisted housing or in a home or apartment whose owner has a federally backed mortgage. If they're not able to pay their rent, they are protected from eviction for 4 months. And there are additional resources that are provided for additional public housing, Section 8 assistance as well. I would also mention, I talked about the student meals. There is also expanded access to food assistance through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Small businesses and workers who have been rocked by the massive disruption that this virus has caused to our economy shouldn't have to worry about paying the bills. And this bill takes steps to address that. There are direct payments. This is probably what's gotten the most attention in the media. Individuals making up to $75,000 and married couples making up to $150,000 will receive payments of $1,200 per person, with an additional $500 payment per minor child. And those payments decrease as income goes up as well. And those payments will be issued by the IRS via direct deposit and will be based on 2019 or 2018 tax returns, or for retirees based on 2019 Social Security statements. I heard from the prior speaker concern about folks losing their jobs. Under this law that was signed on Friday, there's an expansion of unemployment insurance assistance so that people can get wage replacement. The average worker will see unemployment assistance that is on average equal to the amount that they received when they were working for the average American worker. There's extended unemployment of an additional 13 weeks and expanded eligibility. So folks who might be sole proprietors or independent contractors or gig workers are now made eligible for unemployment assistance. There are also new resources to small businesses. For the first time, loans through the SBA that can be forgiven if the small business holds on to their workers. So in essence, those become grants. And finally, military service members and their families and military communities should have the support that they need to get through this crisis. And this bill puts resources toward that problem as well. The bill provides $10.5 billion in total to the Department of Defense to boost its response to the pandemic. Of that, $1.5 billion will go to the National Guard to help sustain up to 20,000 members of the Guard for the next 6 months as they're called upon by states to support pandemic response efforts. About $1.5 billion will go to support efforts by the active duty services and reserve forces. A total of $3.8 billion will go to the Defense Health Program to make sure that it has the resources that it needs to care for the military community. Additionally, the bill carves out $415 million for DoD research and development of vaccines and antiviral pharmaceuticals. The bill includes $1.5 billion to expand military hospitals and triple the available beds at military treatment facilities. And there's another $1.45 billion for the Defense Working Capital Fund as the Defense Logistics Agency and military services work to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on production lines, supply chain, military depots, and labs. And finally, the bill includes $1 billion for the Defense Production Act to increase access to materials necessary for national security and pandemic recovery. All of this funding for the DoD will help you and your communities respond to the unique challenges that folks are facing and help service members both play a role in our whole of government approach to the crisis as well as to maintain their readiness to protect our national security and safety as they always do. So bottom line, this legislation, the CARES Act, will immediately bolster our healthcare system, our economy, help our service members, their families, and their communities face the challenge of this crisis. Beyond that, we all know there's more work to do. Congress is already beginning work on a fourth emergency response bill. Among other things, it's expected that this fourth bill will focus on infrastructure investments to restart the economy, as well as resources to help those in need. I intend to strongly push that those infrastructure investments include those important to military communities, like investments in military construction and facilities maintenance and the sustainment accounts. I also think it's an opportunity to robustly fund the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, which is a program with incredible potential to make a positive impact in places like Bremerton in my district and communities surrounding Joint Base Lewis-McChord, like those in Pierce County right outside my district. And so let me just end by saying, certainly I invite your partnership in advocating for those priorities and making sure that those are reflected in any further legislation. We're all in this together now. As we try to get through this pandemic, we all need to work together once we begin restarting the economy and recovering as a country from this unprecedented crisis. I know that you mentioned that folks will be able to ask questions. I can stay on the line until just before 12:30 if there's any questions directed towards me. But again, thanks for giving me the chance to speak today. And remember, folks, please stay home if you can. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Congressman Kilmer, for joining us today, and thank you for your strong support for military communities and military families. And I want to publicly thank you for all the work you did to champion the Defense Community Infrastructure Program last year. And we look forward to working with you as we make sure defense communities and military families continue to receive the support they need through this crisis. Let's now turn to our panel that we have invited to join us today to take a deep dive into the stimulus, its evolution, and what comes next. I'm pleased to be welcomed by a great group of experts: Jamie Miller, former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs, and who's now a Senior Advisor with the Roosevelt Group; Mackenzie Eaglin, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute; John Conger, former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and now Principal with the Conger Group; and Mary Catherine Ott, Legislative Director, Homeland Security and Public Safety for the National Governors Association. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks.
I'm going to start with Mackenzie. The Congressman hit on some of the high-level points of the stimulus. It's some of the press coverage and coming out of Congress has called it a wartime level investment in our country. How does this really compare in the past, and how do we kind of think about it as a wartime level investment?
Thanks so much. Well, and I appreciate the Congressman's overview of the stimulus, or at least this phase 3, third part, and the good news that there's a fourth. We'll get to that later. Well, how it compares is firstly relative to the threat, and the threat is this virus and its rapid spread and the lack of a vaccine at the time, and then currently, and the lack of adequate medical supplies to treat those infected. So that's the threat. The president has called this threat the invisible enemy. And now often and regularly invokes himself as a wartime president, and he's also using authorities as such that follow, such as the Defense Production Act, which I can certainly talk about near the end of our remarks on the stimulus if you would like to. And how does it compare relative to spending and in dollar terms? I mean, I don't think we have seen the end of the spending or of the stimulus, as the Congressman rightfully noted. This is an issue that's changing quickly, and I think Congress will continue to respond as needed. So where we are now, well, this was it was over $2 trillion stimulus spending bill. Like I said, it's the third and by far the largest, but it will not be the last. Almost 2 decades of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan by comparison, about 1.5 trillion, depending on how you count it, meaning excluding costs incurred by the Veterans Affairs Department, for example. But in terms for direct for DOD, relative to like World War II, it's still about half that, but it's a significant amount of money, and we're going to have to continue to revisit how much is needed to combat this until the curve starts to flatten.
Well, let's talk a little more about what's in it for DoD and the support for military families. We got the high level view, but why don't you give your perspective of what you see that's important and some of those things kind of tucked into the bill that may not be apparent at first glance?
Okay, great. Sure. There's several. I think what's most important in this bill, besides certainly the money, because that's what people need. It helps give people, and particularly small businesses, some certainty in a very uncertain time. But the legislative proposals in the stimulus that were approved are equally important because of things that are being waived and flexibilities that are, to rules and regulations. That's going to be very helpful, I think, in particular to companies doing business with the Defense Department, to their workforces, and of course to those in uniform and their families. So it's just got a lot of good legislative waivers and other things that we'll go through. So the Congressman talked about the working capital funds, and that basically this pot of money, it helps basically support, move, maintain, supply the force, and it's given more flexibility. So the total amount for it, I'm sorry, $1.5 billion. He already said that. I'm just going through my own article here. There's now more flexibility so that the Pentagon can inject liquidity into the industrial base. So that gives them the authority to accelerate payments to their contractors and to prop up, in particular, small businesses that might need help, extra financial support. They have a variety of tools by which they can do that. I can, again, talk about that later. The Defense Production Act is another, it's already been invoked by the president. The Pentagon uses it pretty regularly and pretty often. FEMA does too, FBI, DHS, lots of federal agencies use the Defense Production Act with regularity. Some parts of it are not used often, but others are. And in this bill, not only is there more money, again, it's about just over $1 billion if I'm looking up right, but it also, again, tries to cut red tape, essentially, is what it's doing. It's a focus on subcontractors and vendors, second and third tier suppliers to the prime defense companies. There's an emphasis again here and through DPA on small businesses, particularly, key point, those who are in areas of economic decline. And I think that's very important for your listeners to know that. It's helpful to give them some hope as they think about the future. I'll quickly just talk about one more. There's restrictions and other provisions removed on contractors to allow them to basically start working on a contract before the final, ink has been signed on the contract terms and award. So that's helpful to keep things moving more quickly, which they need to right now. And of course, the traditional rules for acquisition are generally in many cases can be waived, kind of like how the services bought the MRAP mine resistant vehicle during the Iraq War. That's just a quick overview.
Great. Well, how about what's not in the bill in terms of what didn't DoD get that it might need moving forward?
Right. So relative to the total amount for this stimulus at over $2 trillion, $10 billion for DoD, I mean, that's in relative terms, that's like pennies in the couch cushions. So that gives you a sense, though, of how fast this pandemic is changing the country and how DoD's response, how small it is right now in support of civil authorities and state and local officials and governors. I expect that to fundamentally, to fully shift and grow much larger, and you'll see the dollars grow with it. But the Pentagon is also busy to deal with the health of its own force and their families as well. So they have two issues. They need to be supporting the pandemic in every way possible and stopping the spread of it. And they need to do their day jobs to be ready for any other type of national security emergency that's not pandemic related. They need to be healthy. And there's a shortage of masks everywhere, and DoD is giving away some of its own masks and ventilators. They're going to need to replenish those stocks as well. They need testing kits, the Navy in particular, as aircraft carriers seem to be going down left and right, not literally, but figuratively, of course. It's a really scary time. So What's not in it is it's not a lot of money, but it will be. And I unfortunately think because one, you're going to see a greater infection rate in the defense family from those in uniform to their family members to contractors who work with the department, as well as significant workload increase by the department in support of federal, state, and local agencies and officials.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Let me turn to Jamie. Jamie, you've been kind of tracking how this bill is going to be supporting military families and other DoD components. Maybe if you want to share a little what you've been learning and what we might be able to share with our listeners today.
Thank you. Yes, I know that Blue Star Families and ADC have been putting out a lot of resources and information on where military families can go to get support. And I want to highlight some of those resources and share them with you. I grew up in a military family, and I know how challenging it can be even in the best of times. And I know right now everyone is bombarded by information. And so I want to make sure that we're highlighting those resources at the department that our military families can go to. And Mackenzie, the reason why this is so important, Mackenzie touched on it, the department is trying to balance readiness. It's trying to execute the national defense strategy. It's trying to move towards the future force. It's been focusing on lethality. And in the midst of that, it's now worrying about the health and safety of its personnel and its families. And so for those folks who haven't been to defense.gov recently, I would highly recommend that. They have actually just put out a website to do some rumor control, so some myths and facts. But I really want to focus on the Office of Military, Community, and Family Policy at DoD and their work with the site militaryonesource.mil. Again, it's militaryonesource.mil. It is a DoD-funded program, existing program that they have shifted their lens. They provide a call center, a live chat, a website. It's available at no cost to service members and their immediate family for active duty, National Guard, Reserve. Some veterans and immediate family members are eligible for up to 365 days post-separation or retirement. And there are all kinds of information on this website, including counseling, non-medical counseling, financial counseling, a whole bunch of tools that can be used, spouse education programs, all those types of things. And so I would strongly recommend folks going to that website, militaryonesource.mil, as a source of information to get those day-to-day, how do I do this thing questions answered. And then I also want to make sure for our service members who do have children at DoDEA schools, there's also a site for the DoD education activity and their response to COVID. And then the other thing that I would say about just generally then about DoD and its response outside of this third phase of the legislation, because I think that's been covered very well, are a couple of key questions. So, there's still some confusion about who is essential to national security, both within the DoD workforce and within the defense industrial base. So I think there's some more work to be done there. DoD's response from the medical support side, deployment of the Mercy and the Comfort, the Army Corps standing up alternate care facilities, DoD calling up reserve and retired medical personnel who aren't already on the front lines, the early graduation of 200 medical students. Those types of things are ways the department is mobilizing in support of the COVID response. So let me stop there and we can move on to the next topic.
Thanks, Jamie. I want to turn to Mary Catherine Ott from the Governors Association. Governors have definitely been front and center in this crisis. And I wanted to get your perspective on, what states were asking for in this stimulus, and did they get what they needed?
Great, thanks. And it's great. And also from a logistical perspective, as a staffer, it's great to have governors out in front, but that means there's a lot of work on the back end. So as you all know, governors, every issue is of importance to them. And I will say from the beginning of March, They have been front and center with Congress in terms of talking about what state needs are. On March 4th, we actually had 38 governors signing a letter to Congress talking about what was needed in at least the first supplemental, which ranged from medical equipment, testing, public outreach, wraparound services, National Guard personnel, transportation, and all those quarantine-related activities. And here we are a month later, seeing the largest package of federal funding that we've ever seen, and being very much involved in all of that, and kind of leading up to Supplemental 3, what governors really articulated to Congress and are articulating now to the administration is the need for flexibility in direct spending. So the current supplemental includes $150 billion of direct funding to states, which is great in terms of it helps to address those unique needs that states need, be it from employment issues, education issues, food security issues, as was mentioned before, to include some of the military aspects as well. Obviously, with that amount of money, that's a lot to come down to states. So we do kind of remain concerned from an administration standpoint in terms of, do we have enough personnel to really help ensure that individuals are getting what they need at the end of the day. So really that flexible and direct funding has been critically important for governors. We obviously then, from a Defense Department standpoint, have really been articulating for increased funding for the National Guard. As you all know, governors are commanders in chief of their respective National Guard, and that unique mission that Guard members serve as civilian, connected to their civilian personnel, our communities, is critically important. And so we've also looked at the Defense Production Act. $1 billion in there is critically important. However, we governors have been very articulate in terms of the competition right now a little bit on the open market when it comes to PPE and ventilators, and I can touch on that a little bit later, but that is something that we're keenly interested in keeping an eye out on. And some of the other issues I think which come forward from the current supplemental is seeing that influx in money coming from unemployment. So how do we kind of move forward on that? How do we administer those programs both at the federal and the state level, looking at schools and what money has come down to schools for remote learning, food services for children. Obviously, there's a population of individuals out there who their kids are getting their breakfasts and lunches at school, and if they're not there, ensuring that that food supply for low-income families especially is out there. So those are kind of the big issues. It's everything at this point in time, but the willingness to work with states directly and providing that money has been critically important for governors and states.
Thanks. Maybe if you can share with us a little, I know the governors are continuing to work with the president and the vice president, have weekly conversations. What are the big issues you see coming up now and things that would be of interest to us?
Great, yeah. So for the past 3 weeks, governors have had at least a weekly call with the VP as well as the president. I think it's gone kind of bi-weekly in the past 2 weeks. And ahead of each of those meetings, governors through NGA have put together a memo to the president highlighting their top 5 priorities. So if we look at it 3 weeks ago, that flexible spending and flexible money and direct money to states was one of those, and we've kind of seen that, so it's dropped off the list. But increasing access to PPE, masks, test kits, extraction kits, and accelerating the production of this life-saving equipment has been top of the list. Supporting the National Guard in Title 32 activation. So for communities out there, it's a state managed, it's the governor's command and control, federally funded, federally benefits at the end of the day. So governors have asked for that flexibility to ensure their service members, their guardmen are actually being protected as they are responding to the COVID-19 outbreak. We've also governors have asked for a little bit more clarity on the Defense Production Act. So we've seen it invoked. We've seen, I think, 3 executive orders right now related to the DPA, but we haven't seen the full execution of it. So seeing that we have $1 billion now from Congress on it, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of competition for resources, scarce resources on the market. I think you've seen some governors, especially Governor Cuomo today, highlighting the competition state to state on the open bidding process, and then FEMA coming in and then buying out some of those items. I think there's a little bit more of a call now to, if FEMA is going to step in, FEMA steps in and uses the DPA in partnership with DOD and other agencies to purchase and allocate those scarce resources. So that's an ongoing conversation. And additionally, we saw some action in terms of Real ID, which is not necessarily important for this community. But we've also said ensure federal employment or unemployment insurance systems are prepared for this increase that we obviously are already seeing of individuals applying for those services. So those are some of the big 5 priorities governors have been bringing to the White House.
Great, thank you. Why don't we move on and talk a little about what's going to happen next? I mean, we heard at the beginning that it sort of evolved like this, that we have these phases of support, and the Congressman mentioned the next bill is already in discussions. I want to first turn to Jamie and have her share kind of what we see moving forward. We also have, the normal, fiscal, budgets happening at the same time, but maybe give your perspective on what you see phase 4 looking like and what might be part of it.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's pretty clear the coronavirus response has bumped virtually every other legislative priority. It's causing the congressional leadership to calculate how to get critical legislation that is not coronavirus related across the finish line before the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, before the election, and before the end of the calendar year. With the Congress in recess until at least 20 April, maybe beyond that, the House has already announced that it's going to add some days back into the voting schedule that may have been recess or non-voting days to try and get through that work. And Capitol Hill has largely moved to telework. The Pentagon is probably at about 20% capacity right now. From the Hill perspective, you've got the House and Senate Defense Committees, the Authorizing Committee, the Appropriations Committees that are continuing to work through fiscal year 21 defense appropriations and authorization, the policy legislation. Both of those committees in the House, or both of those defense and appropriations and authorizing committees in the House and Senate had key milestones for April and May for their bills. One committee, the House Armed Services Committee, has already announced a delay in their schedule. The good news is they've introduced what they would call a shell bill to move the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a key first step. And then you have the Senate Armed Services Committee, which has outlined a plan for what they're calling paper hearings to continue their buildup towards their markup of the National Defense Authorization Bill in May. But you can already start to see those schedules starting to slip to the right. And decisions that have to be made about what can be addressed now versus what can be addressed in the longer term. And then on the DoD side, they're in the middle of delivering their FY21 priorities to the Hill. So this pandemic hit in the middle of posture season where department leadership, service secretaries are going to the Hill to share with Congress their budget priorities. And then simultaneously, while the department is trying to build their FY22 budget proposal, which kind of the first round of that is due June 1st. And we've already heard some of the services asking to delay the submission of those budget priorities. So this does have an impact on the runway available for Congress to do its work and some of those key defense pieces of defense legislation. And then shifting to phase 4 and what it might look like, Congressman Kilmer touched on this, and I want to share a little bit more. The good news is there seems to be consensus that a phase 4 is coming. The president has called for a $2 trillion package focused on jobs and infrastructure. Speaker Pelosi has said there will be a phase 4. I've heard other members talk about a phase 4 and then a phase 5. Speaker Pelosi called stage 3 the CARES Act mitigation, and then the next stage recovery. She said yesterday that stage 4 will largely be focused on helping frontline medical workers, homebound parents and patients who have the virus, support to state and local governments, and then the big ticket item, investments in transportation and water infrastructure, broadband, and schools. Republican leadership of the House Transportation and Infrastructure and Energy and Commerce Committees have also indicated that infrastructure, water resources, and broadband are all top priorities. We have been hearing from some members, including Leader McCarthy on the Republican side in the House, who said they need to know if stages 1 to 3 have been working before Congress crafts a stage 4. But I think the large majority of the Congress is already moving in that stage 4 direction. Timing is uncertain. I I think they will likely, as Congressman Kilmer said, work on stage 4 over the next couple of weeks to be ready whenever Congress does come back into session. I think a key issue is going to be how to pay for it. Whether it needs to be paid for, will they continue to rely on deficit spending? And so I think we're going to start to see a little bit more of that public debate and dialogue on pay-fors. And then bottom line, I spoke to a number of members last week who said they are focused on getting stimulus resources out the door right now. And they believe we're going to be dealing with the response to this for an extended period of time.
And Jamie, we also just have a question of how Congress will operate during this period, and some discussion of will we move to remote voting? Have you heard anything about that option actually moving forward?
Excellent question. This is very timely. Congress is looking at potential new voting procedures. They're trying to find that balance between the health of members. We've seen a number of members of Congress, Capitol Police, who have been diagnosed recently, the safety of their staff, and then balancing that with getting the business of the country done. And remote voting is very controversial on both sides of the aisle. You have members on both sides of the issue. There is not a current mechanism for remote voting. There are a number of constitutional or legal, procedural, not to mention cybersecurity hurdles to remote voting. And congressional leadership has said it's really not viable in the near term. So remote voting is not a near-term solution, but they are studying it over the long term. They are looking at options like voting by proxy, allowing another member to cast their vote, online or phone voting, extending the amount of time that's allowed for voting to reduce crowding in the chambers. But all of those things only deal with voting. And it's only a small percentage of what actually goes on in Congress. How are members going to conduct their business of, negotiating legislation, talking about offering amendments, having that fulsome debate, representing their constituents. Those nuances, that business, independent of how they do the remote voting or not, is a core issue for the Congress as an institution to try and figure that out. And so I think time will tell. I know the leadership on both sides, both chambers are working really hard to figure out what's the right answer here.
Thanks, Jamie. I want to turn on Conger. John, you sat in the Pentagon for many years, top leadership position, and had a chance to kind of look over the entire enterprise and understand how it works. What else should we be thinking about as we think about what's happened so far in terms of supporting DoD and what could be happening next as we start thinking about phase 4?
Thanks, Tim. So I think that it's important to think back to some of the comments that Mackenzie made, where she's talking about this only being $10 billion in this particular supplemental. I think that's important to recognize that this is not an earth-shattering amount of money, but it went to a lot of the right places. One of the things to note about what's going on now is it's preparing the DoD health enterprise for the stress to come. If you look at the patient load at DoD right now, you're looking at roughly 1,000 cases that includes military personnel, dependents, civilians, and contractors, a little bit more than 1,000, which puts it about in the middle range of all 50 states if it was a state itself. And so as you look at that, you think about a lot of the locations that haven't got as high a caseload, that caseload is coming. And so if you look at the DoD personnel and the dependents and the civilians, that caseload may very well be coming. And so spending the money now to prepare the hospitals now is going to be important to be able to sort of weather the storm, as it were. I think that it's going to be important for so at the senior leadership levels, as they contemplate what they're dealing with, they're not only thinking about how do I help the broader challenge today, but also how am I going to be able to deal with my national defense mission and keeping my personnel and their dependents and the civilians and the contractors healthy and to be able to continue to do my mission. I think that in those, so that's one sort of category of concern. I think there are other categories of concern as well. Obviously, in the near term, when you're facing a crisis, you spend money, and it wasn't always appropriated for the purpose you're spending it for. The department does something called cash flowing. They take money that they don't need until later, and they spend it now on something slightly different. But they're going to need, wherever they took the money from, they're going to need to fill that hole later on. And it might be like fourth quarter personnel and pay, and it might be, and it might be, other items that they are shorting now in order to pay for the crisis now. But they're going to come to the Congress with bills later on, and that $10 billion doesn't cover it. They're going to need to worry about readiness and training impacts. How do you make up the training when you cancel exercises, when you have to maintain social distancing or whatever? How do you deal with interruptions in procurement? How do you deal with the likely budget pauses that you're going to be dealing with? In other words, what are they going to do to enable them to manage the entire enterprise through this crisis, not just provide assistance through this crisis? I think managing hospitals is going to be something that is a near-term concern. Right now, the patient load hasn't overburdened the hospitals, but as the crisis moves on, we've seen some projections in the media that the military bases, in particular training bases, might get hit harder in the coming weeks. If that happens, how do the medical facilities manage? Do they manage focusing just on their personnel? Do they manage focusing on personnel and dependents? What happens to the retiree populations that need services and might be in a higher risk group? All of those things are issues that the medical commands at DoD are going to have to manage through in order to take care of all of their populations and all their responsibilities. So this is just the beginning, I guess. I don't mean to end your conversation with all sorts of problems, but I think that there are all sorts of problems that we haven't seen the beginning of. This is just the tip of the iceberg right now that we're going to have to manage through. So I'll pause there. I think I answered your question. I might have answered it.
Well, well, why don't you share a little what you see in the next stimulus and what could help not only DoD, but we also probably have to start thinking about what's going to help those local economies, including in our defense communities.
Right. So the infrastructure bill has been a running joke in this town for the last 3 years. We always talk about, oh, it's going to come this year. It's like waiting for Godot, right? It's waiting for the infrastructure bill. And so now we might actually have a real chance of getting an infrastructure bill and spending some money and jumpstarting the economy. Because fundamentally, that's what's one of the challenges here is that the economy is stalling, but the fundamentals should all be in place. So what you need to do is to jumpstart it, and they want to spend money to jumpstart things. Infrastructure is a good way to do that. Obviously, there's a lot of military construction that could be funded, whether that's focused on healthcare or it's focused more broadly. But I think, Congressman Kilmer actually listed off a lot of really good stuff when he started his discussion. He talked about making sure that the fourth supplemental includes MILCON. He said he wanted to include facilities sustainment, restoration, and modernization, all of which, frankly, facilities repair on military bases goes largely to small businesses in the community. So that is a very important funnel to help sustain local business. But I think what you want to hear is Congressman Kilmer mentioned DCIP. He mentioned the Defense Communities Investment Program, and I think that program is now in place. I don't know that the rules are all out there yet, but now that it's in place, it is a vehicle through which Congress can send money through DoD to get to those defense communities to address their needs. It is a very flexible program, and so in that context, you can steer the money towards a variety of different purposes, and it really depends on how you want to customize the instructions that are given when the funding is provided, or whether you just want to leave it up to DoD. There's a lot of money that DoD could spend today, and a lot of money that communities could spend today that is, not to use a term that was overused 10 years ago, but shovel ready, right? In the same way that after the financial crisis they wanted shovel ready projects, now they're going to be looking for shovel ready projects. Where are you going to spend that money? What's ready to spend? Because I don't want to spend money that is not going to actually turn into jobs for 3 or 4 or 5 years. I want to create jobs today.
Great. Let me turn to a couple questions. We've had a lot of great questions coming in. I've tried to integrate some into the discussion today, and this is for the whole panel. One question coming in, it's a good one, is that our military force has been at war for 20 years. We're asking a lot of them in this crisis. They're building hospitals. We're sending our National Guard. We're stepping up on the medical front, supply chain. And then at the same time, we could be facing a growing number of service members who are ill because of the virus. How does this all come together? And is there a concern that the military is going to be able to meet this demand that seems to be only growing every day? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to kind of tackle it.
I'll jump in first. It's Mackenzie from AEI, just to tell you what I've been following a lot of the conversations coming out of the Pentagon on this, and basically the priority as it's been stated in certain services, which I think it reflects all the way up to the top, is that firstly, health of the force, that's first. So yes, do they have to be ready to do anything else called upon them that's not pandemic related at any time if needed? Yes. But the Navy, for example, had said, well, it's health of the force is first. Second is to stop the spread of the disease, either here in our own military communities to our families, but also to our allies and partners wherever they are, Japan, South Korea, et cetera. And then third is to maintain warfighting readiness. So the good news is that the concern of the question asker is real. I think it's sinking in at the Defense Department that the force is not going to be good for the fight tonight if they're all sick or can't in quarantine, and they're emphasizing they're getting more serious about safety first.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Anyone else want to touch on that subject? Let me just turn to another question that came in from several of our listeners today. And we've heard this on calls over the last couple of weeks, is there's a lot of challenges right now having to do with PCS and folks who are kind of stuck in this limbo. Kathy mentioned that we have many people paying double rent, or some who are maybe separated from all their goods as this process played out. Is there anything that could be done as we look ahead to the future support on this that might be able to help our military families who are kind of stuck in this PCS limbo?
Tim, I'll go. This is John.
Great, John.
I think that the answer is yes. Obviously, there are things that can be done. I think the challenge is that those things aren't in place yet. I think that legislators like Congressman Kilmer, but others, I'm sure, will want that input, and organizations like ADC and Blue Star Families are going to need to collate, and provide that input to legislators so that it can be put into legislation, that we can turn it into policy. The DoD is a synchronized machine. There are a lot of moving parts. And whenever something like this happens, not that things like this happen all the time, but whenever there's a crisis, a lot of those parts are going to stop moving, and it's going to throw things out of sync. And a lot of things are going to need to get fixed. And people at the leadership level are not going to necessarily have full visibility as to that complete list. They're going to need that input and that feedback to come up and to come into the chain, and then the appropriate policy, funding, et cetera, to be put into place. Because I think it is very clear that everybody wants to take care of military families. They all want to take care of military personnel, and they want to take care of defense communities. And the question really is, as long as they know what the things are that need to be done, I have a suspicion that the will is going to be there to do it.
Thanks, John.
Hey, Tim, this is Mary Catherine with NGA real
Go
quick,
ahead.
and I will do, at least from a local perspective, as much as we've seen. I know Congressman Kilmer highlighting protections from mortgages and the like, but I would encourage folks on this call. I'll do the personal plug of nga.org/coronavirus. We've been tracking all the actions related to gubernatorial actions in the state, and as part of that, looking at what states are doing for individuals to ensure there are no evictions, that you can stay in your rent if need be, and mortgages and the like. And I know this issue specifically for those service members who expected to be out of their lease and now aren't moving, challenges associated with that. So that's something we have highlighted. We do daily emails directly to the governors to say, make sure you're taking into consideration service member challenges in terms of obviously the PCSing. So encourage members here on this call to go look and see what your localities are doing to help support service members.
Thank you, Mary Catherine.
This is Jamie. I will just jump in and add again, the militaryOneSource.mil website addresses FAQs like, what happens with my household goods that have already been picked up? I left my vehicle somewhere, I've ended my lease and I don't have a place to live, and have provided resources and phone numbers for people to call and get that direct support, both through DoD generally and then also through their chain of command.
Thanks, Jamie. One last question, and I'll open this to anyone who wants to tackle it. $2 trillion is a lot of money, and we're talking about more potentially, and that was phase 3, and we had billions before that. How is this money being managed so that we don't have waste and fraud, and that it actually goes to the people and needs it? Is there things within the bill that you see that are going to be good to make sure that this is going to help those who need help?
This is Mary Catherine with NGA. I will just highlight within the bill itself, there's established a Coronavirus Accountability and Transparency Committee, which looks at a bunch of the IGs across the federal government who are tasked to actually do that, to ensure that there's no waste, fraud, and abuse in terms of the obligation of the money. So that's something, there is that system there in place. I will highlight too, for folks to kind of a little context moving forward, of $2 trillion in an era where the federal budget annually is around $5 trillion. So as we think about where we go moving forward, and this goes back to Jamie's point about kind of, if we're going to go into the deficit a little bit more, of how much money do we have to really move forward. So one, they have put in that kind of process, checks and balances, at least at the federal level. And then at the state level, we are working to ensure that we're auditable. We have paperwork. We're going to really kind of push to ensure there's standardized paperwork for individuals who are processing these payments, so that we're not in a fraudulent perspective of all of this influx of cash to the states directly.
Thank you. Anyone else want to touch on that? Well, I'll remind all of our listeners today, we got a lot of other questions that came in, very specific questions, and we're gonna pull those all down. We'll try to answer as many as possible and post them onto our website. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. I think it's been a great discussion. We've covered a great amount of information in a short period of time. So thank you all for being here today and giving us your expertise. Before we close, let me welcome back Kathy to talk a little more about some of our post-town hall follow-up. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you, Tim, and what a great panel. Thank you to all our panelists. Please check your email following this town hall. You'll all be receiving follow-up information regarding this discussion, including a post-webinar survey. Please take a moment to take that survey, because we use that to decide what we're going to cover next and how to improve how we provide information for you. We're capturing your feedback. And as a reminder, a link to the pain points poll, which you saw highlighted at the beginning. I appreciate John Conger's reference to how important that information is. So if you can help us push that out so we can keep collecting those points, it'll help us really make a difference. Please take it or share it with your contacts. Back to you, Tim, one more time to share next steps.
Thanks, Kathy. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you'll join us for our next Military Support Town Hall meeting. It's taking place on Thursday, April 2nd. That's this Thursday, 3 o'clock Eastern. The next topic is supporting defense-impacted businesses and the defense supply chain during the COVID-19 crisis. So we look forward to having you join for our next event. And again, check our website for updated information, and you'll all be receiving our new newsletter on a daily basis to stay up to date on everything happening with the crisis. Thank you all for joining us today.